Now, folks, gather up close to the fire, 'cause tonight's tale ain't from my boyhood. No, sir. This here happened when I was a grown man with a family of my own to protect. My son was but 8 years old that winter, and my little daughter weren't nothing more than a bundle on Eleanor's hip. I reckon every farmer knows there's winters, and then there's winters. This was one of them. Eleanor felt it first, the way she always did. "Silas," she said that morning, baby on her hip, "that wind's got a mean feel to it." I didn't pay her much mind at first, but something in her voice stuck with me like a splinter. I went about my chores anyhow, fed old Bessie the mule, stubborn as a Missouri hill, checked on Rosie and Clover, our milk cows, gentle as could be and worth more to us than gold, gathered eggs from hands that was clucking something fierce, more restless than I'd ever seen 'em. By midday, the sky had turned from gray to something darker. I stood by the barn watching them clouds roll in from the northwest, thick as a quilt, and felt that old dread settle deep in my chest. See, folks, that barn weren't just a barn. It held near about all the grain we'd harvested, corn and wheat to see us through to spring, and it held Bessie, Rosie, and Clover, and the chickens roosting up in the rafters. If that barn went down, or the animals froze, or the grain got ruined, I don't rightly know how we'd have made it through that winter. Come evening, the wind was howling round the house like a wounded animal. Eleanor had supper on, a good hearty stew, and we all sat down together, same as always. My son, full of questions, the way boys that age are, asked, "Pa, is it gonna storm tonight?" I kept my voice steady, even with my insides twisted up. "Might be a big one, son, but we'll be just fine, long as we look after each other." He nodded, trusting his paw the way children do. My daughter just gurgled happy in her mama's arms, too young to know what was coming. There's a mercy in that, I reckon. Eleanor and I traded a look across that table, one of them looks that don't need no words, married long enough to read each other plain, and what I read in her eyes was the same quiet fear sitting in my own chest. After supper, I bundled up and went back out to check the animals one more time. The wind cut through my coat like it weren't even there, and the snow had turned to the driving sideways kind, the kind that means business. The animals was restless, Bessie stomping, the cows low and uneasy, the chickens bunched tight in the corner. Animals know things, folks. They feel a bad storm long before we do. I stood a moment with my hand on that rough barn door, listening to the wind gain strength. Lord have mercy, I thought. Please let this barn hold. By the time I made it back inside, the storm had found its full voice, screaming now, not howling, like the whole sky had opened up its fury on our little piece of land. Eleanor looked up from the fire, face pale. "How bad, Silas?" "Bad enough," I told her, trying to keep steady. "Bad enough we're gonna need every ounce of strength we got before this night's done." Outside, the wind slammed against our walls like it meant to tear the house down. And somewhere in that howling dark, I could hear that barn creaking under the weight of what was coming. My son looked up at me, trying hard not to show his fear, being the little man of the house he fancied himself. And I knew, standing there in the warm firelight with the storm raging outside, that before this night was through, I was going to have to go back out into that fury, because out there in that barn was everything we had. The storm weren't finished with us yet, folks, not by a long shot. I pulled my coat tight and looked at Eleanor. I gotta go check on 'em, I said. Make sure them animals are secure. She didn't argue, though I could see the worry plain on her face. She just nodded and said, "Be careful, Silas. Come back to us." I stepped out into a world I hardly recognized. The wind had teeth now, real teeth, and the snow come at me sideways so hard I could barely keep my eyes open. I had to feel my way along the rope line I'd strung up years back from the house to the barn for nights just like this one. My pa, old Elias, rest his soul, he'd taught me that trick when I was just a boy. A man can get lost 20 feet from his own front door in a storm like that, he used to say. Lost and froze before he even knows he's in trouble. I held on to that rope with both hands, pushing through snow already near up to my knees, the wind screaming in my ears like it was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. When I finally reached the barn, I could hear it before I even got the door open. A groaning, creaking sound, deep and low, like the whole structure was fixing to give up the fight. I put my shoulder to that door and shoved with everything I had, and the wind about tore it clean out of my hands once I got it loose. Inside, the animals was in a state. Bessie was pulling hard against her tether, eyes wide and wild. Rosie and Clover was pressed close together in the corner, low and loud and frightened. Up in the rafters, the chickens had gone dead silent, which worried me more than if they'd been squawking. Silence like that meant they was scared clean through. I could see right off what had Bessie so spooked. Up near the roof line on the north side where the wind was hitting hardest, a section of shingles had torn loose, and snow was driving in through the gap something fierce. Worse than that, I could hear a crack, sharp as a rifle shot, from one of the support beams up top, straining under the weight of snow already piling up on the roof. Now, folks, I want you to understand something. A barn like ours, built by my own hands and my paws before that, it's got a kind of strength to it, but it ain't unlimited. Wood can only bend so far before it breaks. And that night, I could actually feel in my own chest that we was getting mighty close to that breaking point. I knew I couldn't fix that roof, not in the middle of a storm like that, not with the wind fixing to take a man clean off his feet if he weren't careful. But I could do something about the weight pressing down. I grabbed the old wooden shovel we kept by the door, and I went to work, climbing up into the loft best I could, pushing snow off where it had started drifting in through that gap, trying to ease the strain on that crackling beam. It was slow work, hard work. My hands near froze, even through my gloves, the wind finding every gap in my coat and stealing the warmth right out of my bones. But I kept at it because I knew what was at stake. I thought of my boy back in that house and my baby girl and Eleanor holding them both close by the fire, trusting me to keep us all fed through the winter that was coming. Down below, Bessie was still fighting her tether, and I knew I had to calm her some before she hurt herself. I climbed back down, my legs shaking from the cold and the effort, and I went to her slow, talking low and steady the way you do with a frightened animal. Easy now, girl, easy. I got you. Ain't nobody gonna let nothing happen to you. She settled some at the sound of my voice, though her eyes was still rolling white with fear every time the wind gave a particular hard gust against them walls. I checked her tether, made sure it was secure, but not so tight she'd hurt herself thrashing, and I moved on to check Rosie and Clover, running my hands along their flanks, feeling for any sign of injury, finding none, thank the Lord. That crack up in the beam sounded again, louder this time, and my heart about stopped in my chest. I looked up into that darkness, snow still drifting down through the gap in the roof, and I knew right then that shoveling snow off the loft weren't gonna be enough, not by itself, not with that wind still building and building outside, showing no sign of letting up. I was gonna need help, and the only help within reach was back in that house, warm by the fire, where I'd told my own family to stay safe. Lord have mercy, I remember thinking, standing there in that freezing, creaking dark. What in the world am I gonna do now? I stood there a long moment, torn clean in half. Every instinct in me said, run back to that house, gather up Eleanor and the children, hold them close till the storm blew itself out. But another part of me, the farmer part that knew what starvation looked like come February if that grain got ruined, knew I couldn't just leave that barn to fend for itself. I made my choice. I fought my way back along that rope line, snow near blinding me, wind trying its best to knock me clean off my feet, and I burst back through the front door of the house, half froze, covered head to toe in white. Eleanor was up in an instant. Silas, what's happened? Beams cracking up in the loft, I told her, my voice shaking near as bad as my hands. Roof's got a gap torn in it. Snow's piling up faster than I can clear it. I need help, Eleanor. I can't do this alone. Now, I want you to understand something about my Eleanor. She weren't no delicate woman who'd wilt at the first sign of trouble. She'd been raised on a farm herself, knew hard work same as any man, and she looked at me that night with a steadiness that near about brought tears to my eyes. I'll come, she said, already reaching for her coat. The children can stay by the fire. Our boy's old enough to mind his sister a spell. She looked over at our son, who'd sat up straight at the sound of trouble, eyes wide but chin lifted, trying hard to look brave. Can you do that for me? Watch your sister. Keep the fire fed. Don't you dare go near that door. He nodded, solemn as a preacher, and I felt a swell of pride even in the middle of all that fear. 8 years old and already stepping up like a man grown. Eleanor bundled up quick, and I grabbed extra rope, another shovel, anything I could think might help. We stepped back out into that howling fury together. And I want to tell you folks, there's a comfort in facing hard times alongside somebody you trust, even when the world's trying its best to tear you apart. We made it back to the barn and I set Eleanor to work steadying the animals while I climbed back up into that loft. The crack in the beam had grown worse in the short time I'd been gone, a long splintering line running near halfway across, and snow was still drifting in through that torn section of roof, adding weight we couldn't afford. "Eleanor, we need to brace it," I told her, and she was right. I climbed back down, and together we hunted through the barn for anything sturdy enough to prop against that straining beam. Old fence posts, a length of timber I'd been saving for a project come spring, anything with enough strength to bear some of that load. It was Eleanor who thought to use the old cart, turning it on its side and wedging it up under the worst section of the beam, giving it something solid to lean against. I climbed back up with the fence posts, and we worked together, me positioning, her handing up what I needed, both of us soaked through and shaking with cold, but neither of us willing to stop. The wind outside had reached a fever pitch by then, screaming round the barn like 1,000 angry spirits, and every gust made that whole structure groan and shudder something fierce. Bessie was fighting her tether again, and the cows had pressed themselves so tight into their corner, I worried they might hurt each other. "It's gonna hold," I told Eleanor, though truth be told, I weren't rightly certain of that myself. "It's got to hold." She looked up at me from where she was steadying one of the posts, snow melting in her hair, her face flushed from the cold and the effort, and she give me a look I'll never forget. Not a look of fear, though Lord knows she had every right to be afraid. It was a look of determination, of pure stubborn refusal to let this storm take what was ours. "We built this barn with our own hands, Silas. Storm's gonna have to work a lot harder than this to take it from us." I managed a tired smile at that, even with my whole body shaking from cold and exhaustion. We kept working, bracing what we could, clearing snow where it drove in through that gap, doing everything within our power to keep that barn standing through the worst of it. But even as we worked, I could feel it, a change in the wind, a shift in the sound of the storm outside. It weren't letting up. If anything, it was building towards something worse, and I had a sinking feeling in my gut that the hardest part of that night was still ahead of us. Up in the rafters, the chickens had gone silent again, and somewhere off in the darkness beyond the barn walls, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice, the sharp, splintering crack of a tree giving way under the weight of the storm, falling somewhere close, too close. "Eleanor," I said slowly, "I think we're fixin' to see the worst of it yet." No sooner had them words left my mouth than the whole barn shuddered something fierce, like the hand of God himself had reached down and give it a shake. Snow and splinters of wood come raining down from that gap in the roof, and Bessie let out a scream that near stopped my heart. Mules don't scream often, folks, but when they do, you know things has gone from bad to worse. "Silas!" Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos, and I turned to see her struggling to hold the brace we'd wedged under that beam, the whole thing threatening to give way under a fresh weight of snow that had come crashing down from somewhere above. I scrambled to her side, added my strength to hers, and together we held that brace steady while the wind outside reached a pitch I ain't never heard before nor since. It weren't just howling no more, it was a full-on roar, like a train bearing down on us, like the whole sky had turned into some kind of raging beast set loose upon our little farm. "The tree," I gasped out, thinking of that crack I'd heard. "Don't matter now," Eleanor shot back. her arms straining against the brace. "Hold this, Silas. Just hold it." We held it, folks. Held it with everything we had. Our arms burning, our hands near froze solid, snow driving in sideways through that torn roof and stinging our faces like 1,000 tiny needles. I don't rightly know how long we stood there, brace against beam, fighting a battle against a storm that seemed determined to take everything from us. It was Bessie who saved us in a way. Her screaming and thrashing got so bad that I had to leave Eleanor holding the brace alone while I rushed to calm her, afraid she'd break her tether and hurt herself, or worse, kick loose a wall in her panic. I grabbed an old blanket and threw it over her eyes, talking low and steady, even though my own voice was shaking. "Easy, girl. Easy now. Ain't nothing gonna hurt you. I'm right here." Slowly, real slowly, she settled, her breathing still heavy and frightened, but the thrashing eased off. And in that small, quiet moment, with Bessie calmed and Eleanor still bracing that beam with everything she had, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, faint, near swallowed whole by the wind, but unmistakable. My son's voice, calling out from somewhere in that storm. "Pa! Ma!" Now, folks, I want you to understand, there ain't no fear in this world quite like the fear a parent feels hearing their child out in a storm like that, when that child's supposed to be safe and warm inside the house. My heart about stopped dead in my chest. "Eleanor, did you hear?" "I heard," she said, her face gone pale as the snow falling around us. "Silas, go. I got the brace." I didn't wait for her to say it twice. I bolted for that barn door, shoved it open against the wind, and there, stumbling through the snow toward the barn, half buried already in drifts that come up past his knees, was my boy, 8 years old, no coat near thick enough for that cold, his sister nowhere in sight, and panic written plain across his face. "Son," I roared, my voice tearing against the wind, and I ran to him, scooping him up in my arms before the cold could claim him proper. "Pa, I'm sorry. I know I weren't supposed to, but the fire went down low and I couldn't get it built back up, and Sister's crying and I didn't know what to do and I got scared." I held him tight against my chest, feeling his little body shaking. Whether from cold or fear, I couldn't rightly say. Probably both. "It's all right, son. You did right coming to find us. You did right." But my mind was racing now, fear cutting through me sharper than any wind. My daughter, alone in that house, with the fire burning low and the cold creeping in. A babe not old enough to tend a fire, not old enough to know how to keep herself warm and safe. I looked back at that barn, at Eleanor still holding that brace with everything she had, at Bessie and the cows and all that grain that meant survival for my family. And then I looked down at my boy, shivering in my arms, and thought of my baby girl alone in that house. Lord have mercy, I thought, my heart tearing in 2 directions at once. How in God's name am I supposed to save it all?
"What is it?" I asked, my arm still shaking from the strain of holding that brace steady. "The old ox yoke," Eleanor said, breathing hard. "The one your pa used, hanging on the back wall. It's solid oak, Silas, stronger than any fence post we got. If we can wedge it up under that beam alongside the cart, it might just hold." Now I want to tell you folks, that yoke had sat on that wall for years, untouched since my pa passed, more a keepsake than a tool we ever thought we'd need again. But Eleanor was right. Solid oak, built to bear weight, built to last. It just might be strong enough. "Can you hold this alone a moment more?" I asked her. She nodded, teeth grit against the strain, and I let go, my own arms screaming with relief and exhaustion both, and rushed to grab that old yoke down off the wall. It was heavier than I remembered, and my froze hands near dropped it twice, but I hauled it up into that loft and wedged it in tight alongside the cart, using every ounce of strength I had left to jam it up under that cracking beam. "Now!" I hollered down to Eleanor, and together we eased off the old brace, holding our breath, waiting to see if that yoke would take the weight. It held, folks. Lord have mercy, it held. That old oak yoke, my pa's yoke, stood strong against a beam fixin' to give way, and I felt a relief wash over me so powerful my knees nearly buckled right then and there. But we weren't out of danger yet. The wind was still screaming, the snow still driving in through that gap in the roof, and I knew we had to do something about that hole before the whole roof gave way entire. "I got an idea," I told Eleanor, and I grabbed an old canvas tarp we kept for covering the hay wagon, thick and near waterproof from years of oiling. Climbing back up into that loft, fighting the wind that tried its best to rip that tarp clean out of my hands, I managed to stretch it up over the worst of that gap, nailing it down at the corners with whatever I could find quick. It weren't pretty, folks, and it weren't gonna last forever, but it slowed that snow and wind down to a trickle instead of a flood, and that was enough to buy us time, enough to keep that barn standing through the worst of the storm's fury. I climbed back down, near collapsing from exhaustion, and Eleanor caught me, held me steady, both of us leaning on each other in that dim lantern light, surrounded by animals that had finally started to settle, sensing somehow that the worst had passed. "We did it," Eleanor whispered, disbelief and relief mixed thick in her voice. "We did," I said back, though truth be told, I could hardly believe it myself. We checked on Bessie, still trembling but calm now, and on Rosie and Clover, huddled close but safe. The chickens had begun to stir again up in the rafters, a few soft clucks breaking the silence that had gripped them for hours. The grain, stacked high in the far corner, had stayed dry and safe through it all. Outside, though the wind still blew fierce, I could hear a change in it, a shift from that raging roar to something more like an ordinary winter storm, fierce but not the world-ending fury it had been just an hour before. The worst of it, I realized, with a relief so deep it near brought me to tears, had passed us by. "The children," Eleanor said suddenly, her eyes wide with the same thought striking us both at once. We didn't waste another moment. Exhausted as we was, half froze and aching in every bone, we made our way back along that rope line to the house, finding our son right where I'd left him, rocking his baby sister gentle in that chair, the fire burning strong and warm, both children safe and sound. He looked up at us with a tired but proud smile. "I kept the fire going, Pa, just like you said." I scooped him up in one arm, still holding his sister, and Eleanor wrapped her arms around all three of us, and we stood there a long moment, folks, just holding each other, feeling the warmth of that fire and the warmth of being together, safe, after a night that had tested every ounce of strength and courage we had. But the night weren't quite done teaching us its lessons yet.
We stayed up most of that night, folks, taking turns dozing by the fire, listening to the wind slowly lose its fury outside. Come the gray hour, just before dawn, the storm had settled into something gentler, Snow falling soft and quiet instead of driving sideways like it meant us harm. I couldn't rightly sleep, not with so much on my mind, so I sat there in that rocking chair with my daughter finally asleep against my chest, watching the first light creep in through the frosted window, and I thought on everything that had happened, how close we'd come to losing it all. The barn, the animals, the grain that meant survival through the rest of that long winter. When the sun finally broke full over the ridge, I bundled up once more and made my way out to survey what the storm had left behind. The world outside was near unrecognizable. Drifts of snow piled up taller than a man in places. The whole farm blanketed in a silence so complete it felt almost sacred after a night of such fury. The barn stood, battered, with that torn section of roof still covered by the tarp I'd nailed down, and that old oak yoke still wedged tight beneath the cracking beam. But it stood, folks. It stood strong against everything that storm had thrown at it. Inside, Bessie greeted me with a soft bray, calmer now, back to her ordinary stubborn self. Rosie and Clover was contentedly chewing on hay, not a hair harmed on either of 'em. Up in the rafters, the chickens had settled back into their usual clucking business, like the whole terrifying night had never happened at all. And the grain, Lord be praised, the grain had stayed dry and safe, every last bit of it, enough to see us clean through to spring. I stood there a long while, hand resting on the rough wood of that barn door, same as I had the night before, only this time the feeling in my chest weren't dread. It was something closer to gratitude, deep and quiet and near overwhelming. Eleanor found me there, our son at her side, bundled up and eager to see the damage for himself. "It held," she said softly, coming to stand beside me. "It held," I agreed. "We held." My son looked up at that patched roof, at the old yoke visible up in the loft, and I could see him puzzling something through in that young mind of his. "Pa, was we ever really gonna lose it? The barn, I mean, and the animals?" I thought on how to answer that, folks, the way a father does when his child asks him something that deserves an honest answer, not just words meant to soothe. "We come closer than I'd like to admit, son, but I reckon that's the way of things out here. This land, this life we've built, it don't come easy, and it don't come without a fight now and again. What matters is we fought together, and we didn't give up." He nodded slow, taking that in the way children do, storing it away for later. And I watched him looking up at that barn with a new kind of respect in his eyes, like he understood something about the world he hadn't quite grasped the night before. We spent that whole day repairing what we could, patching the roof proper once the weather calmed enough to allow it, mending the tarp, securing everything against whatever winter still had left to throw at us. It was hard work, tired as we all was from the night before, but there weren't a bit of complaining from any of us.
just a quiet, steady gratitude that carried us through. That evening, we sat down to supper, same as always, only this time the mood was different, lighter somehow, despite the exhaustion still aching in all our bones. My son told the story of that night to anyone who'd listened for weeks afterwards, how he'd braved the storm to fetch us, how he'd kept the fire burning strong for his baby sister, and I let him tell it, folks, let him feel proud of the courage he'd shown, because Lord knows he'd earned every bit of that pride. Eleanor and we didn't talk much about it after that first day. Some things a husband and wife don't need words for. We just knew, each of us, what we'd faced together, what we'd held on to with nothing but our own strength and stubborn will, and that knowledge sat between us, quiet and steady, like an old friend. Winters come and go out here on the frontier, folks, each one testing us in ways we don't always expect. But that particular winter, the one where we near lost the barn, taught me something I carried with me the rest of my days. It taught me that a family's strength ain't measured in the storms they avoid, but in the storms they weather together, hand in hand, refusing to let go. That old oak yoke stayed wedged up in that loft for years afterwards, long past the point it was needed there. I never did take it down, left it right where it was, a quiet reminder of the night my pa's old tool held our whole world together, and the night my own children showed me just how much courage can live in even the smallest hearts. So when the wind picks up outside your own window tonight, folks, and the world outside grows dark and wild, remember this: storms pass, they always do, and come morning, with the ones you love close beside you, you'll find you're stronger than you ever knew. Sleep well now, folks. Sleep deep and sleep peaceful.